When we think of ancient Egypt, we see vast pyramids rising from the desert, enormous temples of stone, and statues that have stood for thousands of years. But behind these wonders was a story not of mystery or magic, but of people farmers, working the fields, laborers hauling blocks of stone, scribes recording every detail, and rulers organizing their land along the banks of the Nile. Egypt's kingdoms were not built overnight, nor by pharaohs alone. They were built by countless hands, endless effort, and careful planning that turned a river valley into one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Asterisk, tonight, we will drift back to that world of stone and river, of hard labor and enduring legacy, and explore how ancient Egypt built its kingdoms brick by brick, harvest by harvest, century by century. Every civilization begins with geography, and ancient Egypt was no exception. At first glance, the Egyptian landscape seemed harsh and unforgiving, endless stretches of desert under a burning sun, dry sands where nothing grows, and horizons empty of life. And yet, cutting through this desolation ran one of the most extraordinary rivers on earth, the Nile. Year after year, it poured life into the land, transforming desert into fertile soil, feeding generations, and shaping a kingdom that would endure for millennia. Egypt's story, in many ways, is the story of the Nile. Without it, the pyramids would never have risen, the cities would never have thrived, and the kingdom itself could never have existed. The Nile's most remarkable gift was its floods. Each summer, rains far to the south caused the river to swell, sending dark, rich waters northward into Egypt. The floods spilled onto the banks, soaking the land and leaving behind thick layers of fertile silt. For farmers, this was a miracle of predictability. While other ancient peoples struggled with uncertain weather, Egyptians could depend on their river. Each year, they knew when the waters would rise, when they would recede, and when the soil would be ready for planting. In a world where hunger was constant fear, this rhythm of plenty gave Egypt a foundation of stability. Farmers organized their lives around this cycle. As the floods receded, families took to the fields, their tools simple but effective. Wooden plows pulled by oxen, hoes for breaking soil, baskets for scattering seed. They planted wheat and barley, flax for linen, vegetables for daily meals. Irrigation channels carried water from the river to plots further away, ensuring that no patch of land went to waste. Children and elders helped clear weeds, scare birds, and collect harvests. Every hand contributed because every stomach depended on it. The abundance of food allowed Egypt to do what few ancient societies could grow beyond survival. When fields produced more grain than a family needed, the surplus could feed workers, builders, soldiers, and craftsmen. This surplus was the true foundation of the kingdom, because it freed some people from farming and allowed them to specialize in other skills. Stonecutters carved blocks for monuments, carpenters built boats for trade, scribes kept records of harvests and taxes, and artisans created the objects that filled tombs and palaces. In this way, the river's fertility translated directly into culture, power, and progress. The Nile was not only a source of food, but also a highway, flowing northward toward the Mediterranean, while winds blew southward upriver. The Nile provided natural two-way transportation. Boats with sails traveled south, catching the wind, while currents carried them back north with ease. This made communication across the long, narrow strip of Egypt remarkably efficient. Ideas, goods, and officials traveled swiftly. Grain from Upper Egypt could reach the delta, while stone from southern quarries could be hauled to northern cities. The river tied the country together like a single thread, binding distant regions into one kingdom. But the Nile also required management. Floods could vary, sometimes too low, leading to famine, sometimes too high, destroying fields and homes. To handle this, Egypt developed systems of measurement and organization. Early rulers oversaw the digging of canals and the construction of dikes, ensuring that water was directed where it was needed most. Officials measured fields, recorded yields, and planned for storage. Surplus grain filled great granaries, insurance against years of poor floods. Out of these practical needs grew some of the earliest forms of administration and record-keeping. In short, the river demanded order, and the Egyptians answered by building a structured society. Life along the Nile was both communal and cooperative. Villages clustered near the riverbanks, their homes made of mud brick, shaped from the very soil. Left by floods, families lived close to their fields, rising with the sun to tend crops, returning at dusk with baskets heavy with food. Festivals marked the coming of the flood, times when entire communities celebrated the renewal of life. Songs and stories carried through the air as people gathered along the banks, watching the river rise with anticipation. The Nile was not merely a natural feature. It was the center of existence, the constant presence that dictated survival, prosperity alike. The contrast between the fertile banks and the desert beyond was stark. Step only a short distance from the green fields, and the ground turned to barren sand. This sharp boundary gave Egypt a unique geography, a ribbon of life cutting through lifeless desert. It also offered protection. Armies seeking to invade had to cross vast deserts, while the Nile Valley itself provided resources and defense. In this way, the river not only gave Egypt life, but shielded it from constant attack. The kingdom grew strong behind its natural barriers, flourishing in ways that less protected lands could not. The Nile also shaped the materials of daily life. Papyrus, the plant that grew thickly along its banks, was harvested and pressed into sheets, becoming one of the ancient world's most important writing surfaces. Fishermen cast nets into the river, bringing in catches that supplemented diets of bread and vegetables. Clay from the river banks was baked into pottery for cooking and storage. Reeds became mats, baskets, and ropes. Every part of the river contributed, something turning necessity into invention. Trade, too, was born of the Nile. Boats carried not only grain, but also goods for exchange: linen, pottery, and surplus produce. They returned with timber from Lebanon, copper from Sinai, and exotic items from lands further south. The river made Egypt wealthy, not only through its own abundance, but by opening paths to the wider world. The image of Egypt as a powerful, rich land was built on the silent currents of the Nile, carrying goods to and fro. The rhythm of life along the Nile was steady, but it was also fragile. A poor flood meant hunger, unrest, and sometimes collapse. The memory of famine haunted Egyptians, reminding them of their dependence on forces beyond their control. This dependence shaped their worldview. Everything in life was tied to the rivers. Cycle and careful management was the key to survival. In times of plenty, the kingdom grew strong, expanding its monuments and influence. In times of scarcity, leaders were judged harshly, blamed for failing to provide. In this way, the Nile not only fed Egypt, but also measured the strength of its rulers. Imagine walking along the Nile's banks thousands of years ago. The sun rises over green fields. Farmers bend low with hoes. Oxen pull plows through wet soil. Children chase birds from the grain, while women carry jars of water from the canals. Boats glide silently along the river, sails catching the morning breeze. In the distance, stone cutters haul blocks destined for temples and tombs, their work made possible by the grain stored in village granaries. Everywhere life flows with the river, steady and enduring. The Nile was Egypt's heart, its artery, its lifeline. Without it, there would have been no pyramids, no cities, no kingdoms. Its floods gave food, its waters gave transport, its banks gave materials, and its rhythms gave structure to society. For over 3,000 years, the Egyptians built their world around its currents, turning desert into civilization. To say that Egypt was the gift of the Nile is no exaggeration. It was a truth felt in every breath, every meal, every stone laid in its monuments. The story of ancient Egypt did not begin with pyramids or mighty temples. Long before the first great monuments rose from the desert, Egypt was a land of scattered villages stretched along the fertile banks of the Nile. These small communities were modest clusters of mud brick houses, fields of grain, and people who lived by the river's rhythm. They were not yet part of a single kingdom, nor ruled by a single leader. But slowly, through centuries of cooperation, rivalry, and ambition, these villages grew into chiefdoms, then regions, and finally into kingdoms united under rulers who became known as the first pharaohs. In the beginning, life in the Nile Valley was simple but organized. Families worked together to farm the land, storing grain against poor harvests. Surpluses meant trade, and soon neighboring villages began to exchange goods. Fish for grain, linen for pottery, copper tools for baskets of fruit. Over time, certain villages became stronger, either because of better land, better leaders, or better access to trade routes. These powerful communities began to dominate their neighbors, collecting tribute and establishing control over wider regions. Leadership shifted from simple village elders to chiefs who commanded respect, organized labor, and defended their people with armed retainers. As these chiefdoms grew, they formed two distinct regions: Upper Egypt in the south, where the river cut through narrow valleys, and Lower Egypt in the north, where the Nile spread into its broad delta before reaching the sea. The two regions were different in culture, dress, and traditions. Upper Egypt was marked by the white crown, while Lower Egypt was symbolized by the red crown. For centuries, the two lands coexisted, sometimes in peace, sometimes in rivalry, each vying for influence over the other. The step from chiefdoms to kingdoms required not only military strength, but also organization. Rulers began to standardize practices, establishing systems of measurement, storage, and record-keeping. Scribes recorded harvests, overseers distributed grain, and laborers built storehouses and canals. Villages became towns. Towns became centers of administration. Leaders who could control water, distribute food, and protect their people grew in prestige. Out of this organization came the first kings of Egypt. Tradition tells us of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. This figure, remembered as Narmer or sometimes Menes, became the first to wear the double crown, combining the white and red as a symbol of unity. Whether by conquest, diplomacy, or gradual absorption, the two lands became one, forming the foundation of the first dynasty around 3100 BCE, the Narmer Palette. A carved ceremonial artifact shows a ruler striking down his enemies, wearing first one crown and then the other, a powerful image of unification. Though stylized, it captured the essence of a new era. Egypt was no longer divided. It was a kingdom. Unification changed everything. With a single ruler came the centralization of power. Resources could now be pooled across the entire Nile Valley. Armies could be raised not from one region, but from all of Egypt. Labor could be organized on a grand scale, channeling thousands of workers to build not only irrigation systems, but also the earliest monumental tombs. Trade expanded as merchants carried goods along the full length of the river and beyond into neighboring lands. A sense of shared identity grew, tied to the image of the king as the embodiment of order. The first pharaohs did not rule from palaces of gold, but from practical centers of administration. They oversaw grain storage, water management, and the coordination of labor. Yet even in these early days, they began to craft symbols of power. The double crown represented unity, the scepter authority, the throne legitimacy. Kings were depicted as larger-than-life in carvings and sculptures, towering over enemies and subjects alike. These images were not mere art, they were tools of control, reinforcing the idea that Egypt's stability depended on its ruler. Villages now found themselves part of something far larger. A farmer planting barley in the south was no longer only providing for his family. His grain might feed workers building tombs hundreds of miles away. A potter shaping clay jars in the delta might see his goods carried upriver to store surplus harvests. The kingdom tied distant lives together, creating connections that had never before existed. For the first time, Egypt was a single entity, its people bound by common leadership and common purpose. The shift from villages to kingdoms also brought challenges. Ruling such a vast stretch of land required communication and bureaucracy. Officials were appointed to oversee districts, collect tribute, and enforce the king's authority. These officials became the backbone of a growing state, men whose loyalty determined whether the pharaoh's rule would stand firm or collapse into rebellion. The balance between central authority and local power was delicate, and maintaining it demanded both skill and force. But for ordinary people, life continued much as it had for centuries. They tilled fields, baked bread, brewed beer, wove linen, and cared for livestock. The great changes above them often seemed distant, felt only in the tribute collected or the labor demanded for state projects. And yet, over generations, they became part of a culture that saw itself as united along the Nile, bound to the idea of a kingdom greater than any village or region. The first pharaohs laid the foundation for what would become one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. They did so not with sudden leaps, but with steady steps, uniting lands, standardizing administration, organizing labor, and projecting authority. They turned a scattering of communities into a kingdom into a state, and a state into a culture that would endure for thousands of years. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile in the early days of Egypt's unification. Villages lined the river, their mud brick houses clustered near the fields. Boats glide past, carrying goods and officials. In the distance, a leader stands, wearing the strange and powerful double crown, a symbol that this land is no longer divided. Farmers pause to watch, uncertain yet hopeful, as they realize that their small village is now part of something greater, something enduring. The story of Egypt's kingdoms began not with pyramids, but with unity. It began when scattered villages came together under a single rule, when the river tied people not only to their fields, but to one another. Out of the rhythm of the Nile and the ambition of leaders, the first pharaohs built the framework of civilization. Their legacy was not only monuments, but an idea that Egypt was one, and that unity could outlast centuries. When people today think of ancient Egypt, the first image that comes to mind is almost always the pyramids, those vast stone monuments rising against the desert sky, silent and enduring across millennia. They stand as symbols of power, ingenuity, and human effort. Yet behind their grandeur lies a story not of mystery, but of labor, planning, and sweat. The pyramids were not the work of magic, nor of slaves whipped endlessly in chains, but of tens of thousands of workers who, season after season, devoted their strength to shaping stone into eternity. To understand how Egypt built its kingdoms, one must walk among these stones, not in awe alone, but in recognition of the lives that carried them. The earliest pyramids grew out of simpler structures. At first, Egypt's rulers were buried in mastebas flat, rectangular tombs of mud brick or stone. These gave way to stepped pyramids, like that of Djoser at Saqqara, where layers of mastaba-like forms were stacked one atop the other. But under Pharaoh Khufu, around 2600 BCE, the pyramid reached its greatest scale. The Great Pyramid at Giza, a mountain of stone rising nearly 150 meters high. It was the tallest structure on Earth for thousands of years, built not with modern machinery, but with ropes, sledges, copper tools, and human hands. The construction began with planning. Surveyors measured the desert plateau with remarkable precision, laying out foundations aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points of the compass. Teams leveled the bedrock, preparing a base strong enough to bear millions of tons of stone. Every angle, every line was calculated carefully, for mistakes on such a scale would be catastrophic. That such accuracy was achieved remains one of the most astonishing feats of ancient engineering. Then came the stone itself. Quarries near the building sites provided much of the limestone used for the core blocks, while finer white limestone for the casing was hauled from quarries across the river. Granite for inner chambers came from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers to the south. Transporting these massive blocks required coordination on an immense scale. Boats floated stone down the Nile, unloaded onto sledges, and dragged across prepared roads of mud and stone. Workers poured water on the sand ahead of sledges to reduce friction, allowing dozens of men to haul blocks weighing several tons. The labor force was vast, but not the slave army of popular myth. Archaeological evidence shows that workers were organized into rotating crews, often drawn from farming families during the flood season when fields lay underwater. Villages sent groups of men as a form of duty, providing labor in exchange for food, shelter, and exemption from certain taxes. These workers lived in nearby camps where they received rations of bread, beer, onions, and dried fish. The remains of their houses, bakeries, and breweries have been uncovered near Giza, showing a community that, though temporary, was well supplied. It was grueling work, but it was also seen as service to the state, even a source of pride. The daily routine was relentless. At dawn, workers rose and gathered in teams, each assigned to haul, cut, or set blocks. Stone cutters hammered with copper chisels, their hands blistered from constant blows. Haulers leaned into ropes, muscles straining as they dragged sledges, inch by inch. Overseers shouted orders, keeping the rhythm, making sure teams pulled together. At the construction site, masons fitted blocks into place, smoothing surfaces, adjusting angles, ensuring stability. As the pyramid rose higher, ramps of earth and stone were built to drag blocks upward, their slopes winding around the growing monument. Dust filled the air, the sun beat down, and sweat drenched every body. Accidents were inevitable. Stones slipped, ropes snapped, men fell. Injuries and deaths were part of the process, though the scale of the project ensured replacements were always available. Yet for many, this work was temporary, lasting only a few months each year. They returned to their villages once the floodwaters receded, resuming farming until the next season of labor. In this way, the kingdom harnessed the rhythm of the Nile, channeling idle hands into monumental projects without halting the flow of food. The organization behind pyramid building was as remarkable as the structures themselves. Teams were divided into groups with names, often boasting playful or competitive titles. Records show graffiti left by workers, phrases like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. These markings suggest camaraderie, a sense of identity, even humor among those who toiled. Though their lives were hard, they were not faceless slaves, but men with pride in their role, leaving behind words that still echo in stone. For the pharaohs, the pyramids were symbols of power and permanence. They were not simply tombs, but statements that the king's rule was eternal, that his authority reached as high as the heavens and as deep as the earth. For the workers, the pyramids may have meant something different. They were proof of their labor, visible for miles, reminders that their sweat shaped stone into something enduring. The pride of participation likely softened, though never erased, the pain of the work. Over decades, the pyramids rose block by block, ramp by ramp. When finished, their smooth casing stones gleamed white in the sun, shining like mountains of light above the desert. The Great Pyramid, in particular, dominated the landscape, visible from miles away. Travelers approaching the Nile Valley would see it rising like a beacon, testimony to what organization, labor, and determination could achieve. For the Egyptians, it was proof that their kingdom was strong, stable, and destined to last forever. Yet the human cost must never be forgotten. Behind every stone was a hand that hauled, a back that bent, a body that ached. Thousands lived and died in the shadow of these monuments, their names lost, their faces unknown. Their work fed no poetry, filled no records, earned no glory. And yet, without them, the pyramids would not exist. The endurance of these monuments across thousands of years is also the endurance of their suffering and toil, immortalized in stone. Imagine standing at Giza as the Great Pyramid neared completion. Ramps snake upward, dust clouds rise, men strain. Against ropes, overseers shout commands. The air is filled with the scrape of stone, the thud of hammers, the grunt of effort. In the distance, the Nile glitters, boats unloading more blocks for the endless task. The sun sets behind the half-finished pyramid, casting a shadow across the desert, a shadow that seems to stretch into eternity. The pyramids stand today not only as wonders of architecture, but as reminders of the lives spent building them. They are monuments of ambition, organization, and human endurance. Egypt's kingdoms were built on many foundations: agriculture, administration, trade, but few symbols capture their essence as powerfully as the pyramids. They are Egypt carved into stone, built by sweat, designed with precision, and enduring long after the hands that raised them turned to dust. Every kingdom in history, no matter how grand its monuments or powerful its armies, has rested upon a single foundation: food. Without steady harvests and full granaries, no ruler could build pyramids, wage wars, or commission statues. In ancient Egypt, farming was not simply an occupation, but the backbone of civilization. The farmers of the Nile Valley fed not only their own families, but the entire structure of the kingdom. They were the silent majority, the countless hands, who bent over fields year after year, ensuring that the empire's cities, temples, and armies had the grain to survive. The story of Egyptian farming begins, as always, with the Nile. Each year, when the river flooded its banks, it left behind a fresh layer of rich, dark silt. This fertile soil, renewed annually, allowed crops to grow in abundance. Farmers did not need to clear vast forests or plow dry plains. The river did the work for them, but they had to seize the moment. When the waters receded, the soil had to be planted quickly before the heat dried it. Timing was everything, and the farmers knew the river's rhythm as intimately as they knew the beat of their own hearts. Their tools were simple but effective. Wooden plows, often tipped with copper, were dragged by oxen through the moist earth. Men followed with baskets of seed, scattering grain across the furrows. Others used hoes to break clumps of soil, while children and elders walked the fields, chasing away birds. The work was communal, with entire families laboring together. Even small children carried water jars or helped gather weeds, for every hand mattered in the race against time. The main crops were wheat and barley, used to make bread and beer, the staples of the Egyptian diet. Bread came in countless varieties, from coarse loaves filled with husks to fine, smooth breads reserved for the wealthy. Beer was thick, nourishing, and safer to drink than river water, providing hydration in the hot climate. Together, bread and beer sustained every level of society, from the humblest farmer to the pharaoh himself. Alongside these staples, farmers grew vegetables such as onions, garlic, leeks, beans, and lettuce. Flax spun into linen was another essential crop, clothing the population in its cool, breathable fabric. Irrigation was key to expanding agriculture beyond the immediate floodplain. Farmers dug canals and basins, channeling water from the Nile into fields further away. Chadoof, simple lever systems with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, allowed men to lift water efficiently from the river into channels. This constant management of water required coordination, and communities worked together to maintain canals, repair dikes, and share resources. The organization of irrigation was one of the earliest forms of collective labor, a practice that later enabled the massive projects of pyramid building and temple construction. Harvest time was both exhausting and joyous. Men cut stalks of grain with sickles, women and children gathered them into bundles, and donkeys hauled loads to threshing floors. There, oxen trampled the sheaves to separate grain from husks, while workers winnowed the harvest by tossing it into the air so the wind carried away the chaff. The clean grain was collected, measured, and stored in great mud brick granaries. Officials oversaw the process, recording yields on clay tablets or papyrus scrolls. A portion of the harvest went to the state as tax, another portion to the temples, and the rest fed families through the year. The granaries were more than storage. They were Egypt's insurance against disaster. In years when the Nile's flood was too low, stored grain was distributed to prevent famine. The system was not perfect, and hard years still brought suffering, but the ability to save surplus gave Egypt stability unmatched by many other ancient lands. This stability allowed rulers to plan grand projects without fear of collapse, confident that the farmers' work would sustain the state. For the farmers themselves, life was hard. Their labor was constant, their rewards modest. Taxes were heavy, and the state claimed the best portions of the harvest. Many farmers lived on coarse bread, beer, and vegetables, with meat as an occasional luxury. Their homes were simple mud brick structures, often crowded and hot. Tools wore down quickly, requiring constant repair. Disease and injury were common, born of long days under the sun and nights in cramped quarters. Yet their resilience kept the kingdom alive. Despite their low status, farmers understood their importance. They may not have marched in parades or carved their names into stone, but they knew that without their grain, no one in Egypt would eat. Even the pharaoh's table depended on the bread kneaded by farmers' wives, the beer brewed from their barley, the onions pulled from their soil. Every monument, every temple, every army was built upon their unseen foundation. Trade, too, rested on farming. Surplus grain was exported to neighboring lands, exchanged for timber, copper, and luxury goods. Egyptian bread fed not only Egyptians, but sometimes foreign allies and mercenaries. Farmers, though they seldom saw it, played a role in diplomacy and conquest. Their fields connected Egypt to the wider world, for food was a currency as valuable as gold. Imagine standing in the fields at harvest. The air is filled with the rustle of wheat, the calls of workers, the bray of donkeys. Dust rises as oxen trample stalks, while children laugh as they chase sparrows from the grain. The sun is hot, the work relentless, but the mood is determined. Every sheaf gathered means survival for another year, strength for the kingdom, and security for the future. In the end, Egypt was not built by stone alone, but by bread. The pyramids could not rise without farmers feeding the builders. Armies could not march without farmers filling their packs. Scribes could not write without farmers paying their grain taxes. Pharaohs could not rule without farmers providing the food that underpinned their power. The farmers of the Nile were the invisible strength of Egypt. Their sweat soaked into every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every block of stone. They were the lifeblood of the kingdom, feeding not only an empire but a civilization that endured for thousands of years. In the long history of Egypt, no tool was as powerful as the pen. Monuments of stone may have awed the eye, but it was writing that allowed Egypt to endure as a kingdom of memory, order, and law. Without writing, there could have been no taxes, no administration, no grand projects stretching over decades. Writing preserved harvests on papyrus rolls, recorded treaties with foreign kings, and inscribed names onto tombs so they might be remembered for millennia. Among the countless workers who sustained the Egyptian state, none held more influence with so little physical labor than the scribes, the men whose ink and brush shaped the very structure of the kingdom. The origins of writing in Egypt stretched deep into the past. Long before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbols began to appear scratched into pottery and carved into ivory. These early marks represented ownership or simple ideas, but over centuries they grew into a system capable of capturing entire sentences, thoughts, and histories. By around 3200 BCE, hieroglyphs, the sacred carvings, as later Greeks would call them, had emerged in full form, a writing system of astonishing complexity. Where other peoples wrote with alphabets or simple signs, Egypt's script contained hundreds of symbols, each representing not only sounds but also objects, ideas, and concepts that to look upon a wall covered in hieroglyphs is to enter a world where writing is art. Birds, snakes, eyes, reeds, and hands filled the surface, painted or carved in exquisite detail. Each symbol was chosen not only for sound but for beauty. Words became pictures, and pictures became words. This dual nature of hieroglyphs, both language and artwork, gave Egyptian writing a unique power. It was not merely a tool of communication. It was an expression of culture, a tapestry of images that carried meaning as well as aesthetic force. Learning this system, however, was no simple task. Hieroglyphs required years of study, patience, and discipline. Few in Egypt could read or write. Literacy was limited to an elite class of scribes and officials. Children chosen for this path began their training young, often sent to schools, attached to temples or government offices. There they sat on hard benches, reed pens in hand, copying symbols over and over onto shards of pottery or flakes of limestone, before earning the right to use precious papyrus. Lessons were long and mistakes punished. The memory of these schools survives in texts where former students recall aching backs, harsh teachers, and endless repetition. Yet the rewards of mastery were great, for scribes occupied a privileged place in Egyptian society, that the tools of the scribe were humble yet essential. A wooden palette held cakes of black and red pigment, used for writing on papyrus. Black was for the main text, red for emphasis or headings. Reeds, cut and sharpened to a point, served as pens, dipped into water to mix the pigments. Papyrus itself was made from the tall plants that lined the Nile, their stalks sliced, pressed, and dried into sheets. Light and portable, papyrus allowed records to be stored, copied, and transported with ease. While stone carvings preserved monumental texts, papyrus carried the daily business of the state. The work of a scribe was varied. Some recorded harvests, noting how much grain each farmer produced and how much went into the granaries as tax. Others wrote contracts, recording sales of land, marriages, or inheritances. Military scribes listed soldiers, tallied supplies, and tracked campaigns. court scribes documented trials, ensuring that disputes and judgments were preserved. At the highest level, scribes served kings directly, drafting decrees and correspondence, managing the flow of information across the kingdom. Without their records, Egypt would have been chaos. With them, it became an ordered state capable of projects that spanned centuries. The status of scribes was high, especially compared to farmers, laborers, or even artisans. They were exempt from heavy physical toil, their hands uncalloused from plows or picks. A famous text known as the Satire of the Trades makes this clear. Written as advice from a father to his son, it praises the life of the scribe above all others. Farmers toil in the sun, carpenters risk injury, soldiers face death. But the scribe sits in comfort, pen in hand, commanding respect. To become a scribe was to rise above hardship, to secure stability, and a place in the machinery of power. Yet with privilege came responsibility. Scribes were expected to be precise, for mistakes could be disastrous. An error in a tax record might mean unfair punishment for a farmer. A slip in a treaty could alter the terms of peace. To prevent confusion, scribes developed conventions, formulas, and styles that kept writing consistent. They copied not only words but traditions, ensuring continuity across generations. Through them, Egypt's culture was preserved, its values transmitted, its administration maintained. Hieroglyphs themselves reflected this balance between art and order. They could be written left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, depending on the context. The direction was marked by the way animals and figures faced, guiding the reader's eye. Each text was carefully arranged for harmony, with symbols, balanced to create pleasing compositions. Even mundane records carried this sense of structure. Writing was not only functional but aesthetic, embodying the Egyptian desire for balance and order in all things. Beyond daily administration, writing also preserved memory. Names carved into stone ensured that rulers, officials, and families would not be forgotten. Lists of kings stretched back into the past, linking present rulers to distant ancestors. Stories, hymns, and instructions were copied for generations, giving us today a window into their world. While monuments crumble and voices fade, the ink of scribes has endured, carrying Egypt's culture across millennia. But the life of a scribe was not effortless. Hours bent over papyrus strained the eyes, cramped the fingers, and stiffened the back. The pressure of accuracy weighed heavily, especially for those serving powerful officials. Mistakes could mean punishment, even dismissal. Though they avoided the physical toil of farmers, scribes carried the mental burden of responsibility. Their work was often unseen, tucked away in scrolls and archives, but it shaped decisions felt across the kingdom. Imagine an ordinary day for a scribe in Thebes or Memphis. At dawn, he takes his pallet and reads, joining a line of officials entering the granary. Farmers arrive with baskets of wheat, donkeys laden with barley. The scribe sits on a stool, recording each load, marking carefully how much enters the state's storehouses. Later, he copies reports for superiors, sealing documents with clay. In the afternoon, he practices lines of hieroglyphs, ensuring his hand remains steady. By evening, he returns home with his tools, his fingers stained black and red. His work leaves no scars, but his records will last longer than the lives of those who tilled the fields. The paradox of the scribe's life was striking. They were both privileged and invisible, essential and overlooked. Without them, Egypt could not have functioned, yet they left behind few personal stories. Their legacy is in the words they copied, the contracts they signed, the monuments they inscribed. Through them we hear the voices of kings, the plans of architects, the orders of generals. Without them, Egypt's grandeur might have vanished like sand in the wind, dot in the end. Scribes and hieroglyphs were the silent architects of Egypt's kingdoms. The pyramids could not have been built without records of labor and supplies. Armies could not have marched without lists of men and weapons. Trade could not have flourished without contracts and tallies. Writing gave Egypt its memory, its order, and its continuity. The power of the pen was the power of the state, and the scribes who wielded it ensured that Egypt's voice would echo long after its stones began to crumble. If farming was the foundation of Egypt's survival, then trade was the engine of its wealth. Along the banks of the Nile, the land produced abundant grain enough to feed millions, flax for linen, and papyrus for writing. But Egypt's kingdoms were not built on farming alone. Their greatness came from looking beyond the river, reaching out across deserts, seas, and mountains to gather the resources their land lacked. Trade gave Egypt bronze for weapons, timber for ships, incense for ceremonies, and luxuries that filled palaces and storerooms. It created networks of exchange that tied the kingdom to distant lands, making Egypt not only a self-sufficient river valley, but a hub of international wealth and influence. The Nile itself was the first and most important artery of trade. Boats, light and swift, carried goods north and south, using the river's current in one direction and its steady winds in the other. Barges loaded with grain glided downstream, while vessels with sails tacked against the breeze, bringing goods. Upriver, from the delta to Nubia, the Nile became a highway of commerce. Along its banks rose markets where merchants bartered, granaries where officials tallied stores, and ports where larger expeditions prepared to depart. Without this natural waterway, Egypt might have remained a patchwork of villages. With it, the kingdom became a crossroads of wealth. Within Egypt, the most valuable commodity was grain. Its fertile floodplains made the land one of the richest breadbaskets of the ancient world. Surplus harvests not only fed the population, but also became a form of currency. Grain paid workers, supplied armies, and filled ships bound for foreign markets. In times of famine elsewhere, Egypt's grain was coveted, a treasure more reliable than gold. Centuries later, even the Romans would call Egypt their granary, but the roots of this reputation stretched back to the earliest kingdoms. Beyond grain, Egypt's land offered other exports. Papyrus sheets, durable and light, carried writing across the Mediterranean, making Egypt the source of record-keeping for entire regions. Linen, woven from flax, was prized for its coolness in hot climates, traded as clothing and fabric. Stone, quarried from deserts and mountains, became an export for monuments abroad. From alabaster to granite, Egypt's stones traveled far, carried by ships and caravans to neighboring cultures. Even artisans' goods, pottery, jewelry, and carvings made their way into foreign markets, spreading Egyptian style across borders. But Egypt also had needs that its land could not provide. for timber essential for building ships and large structures, they turned to Lebanon's famed cedar forests. Egyptian expeditions crossed the eastern Mediterranean, trading grain and goods for long, straight beams that could become masts and roofs. For metals, they reached into Sinai for copper, into Nubia for gold, and further still for tin, which when alloyed with copper produced bronze, the metal that defined an age. For ivory and exotic animal products, merchants looked south to Africa. For precious oils, perfumes, and luxury goods, they turned east toward Asia. These expeditions were not small affairs. Caravans of donkeys trudged across deserts, laden with sacks of goods, guarded by armed escorts. Ships hugged coastlines, their sails catching winds, their hulls filled with cargo. Diplomats accompanied traders, negotiating with local rulers and forging alliances. Sometimes expeditions were purely commercial. Other times they blurred into conquest, with Egyptian armies seizing mines, ports, or trade routes. Trade was wealth, and wealth was power. So the state itself often controlled or supervised major exchanges. One of the most famous trade expeditions was to the land of Punt, a region south along the Red Sea coast, remembered as a source of incense, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals. Egyptian records describe ships sailing to Punt, their decks crowded with sailors, their return marked with celebrations. Reliefs show long-necked giraffes, monkeys, and panthers brought back as tribute, along with precious myrrh trees transplanted to Egyptian soil. To the Egyptians, Punt was a land of wonders, a place where wealth and marvels flowed from beyond the horizon. Such journeys reinforced Egypt's image, not only as a receiver of wealth, but as a kingdom powerful enough to reach distant lands and return triumphant. Trade also shaped daily life. In markets, merchants spread mats on the ground, displaying goods brought from afar. Copper tools from Sinai lay beside baskets of grain, linen cloth, and pottery. Spices carried from caravans scented the air, while jewelry made from imported gold glittered in the sun. Bargaining voices rose, coins clinked, donkeys brayed. For ordinary Egyptians, these markets offered glimpses of the wider world, a chance to buy or admire goods from distant places they would never see. The wealth trade brought was not evenly shared. Much of it flowed into the hands of the state and the elite. Pharaohs used it to fund building projects, armies, and lavish courts. Temples received goods as offerings, filling storerooms with grain, oils, and incense. Officials benefited from their roles in administration, overseeing caravans and expeditions. For farmers and laborers, trade's effects were indirect, seen in the demand for surplus harvests or in the employment opportunities created by construction and shipping. Still, even the poorest felt its influence, for the stability and power it created protected their lives along the river. The organization behind trade mirrored that of agriculture and monument building. Scribes recorded exchanges, measured cargo, and tallied taxes. Officials coordinated expeditions, assigning men, animals, and supplies. Workshops prepared goods for export, while granaries released shipments of grain. Every step was documented, every load counted, every debt recorded. Without this meticulous bureaucracy, trade on such a scale would have collapsed into chaos. Yet trade was more than material. It was cultural. Goods carried ideas, stories, and styles across borders. Egyptian art absorbed influences from abroad, just as Egyptian motifs spread into neighboring lands. Languages mingled in markets, and merchants learned phrases in foreign tongues. Through trade, Egypt was connected to a wider world, not isolated but integrated, its kingdoms part of a network that stretched across continents. Still, trade was never without risk. Caravans faced bandits, ships risked storms, expeditions sometimes failed to return. Wars disrupted routes, famine strained supplies. Yet the rewards outweighed the dangers, and Egypt persisted, generation after generation, in seeking wealth beyond its borders. The prosperity of its golden ages was built not only on the Nile's gifts, but on the goods brought home from deserts, seas, and distant lands. Imagine standing at an Egyptian port along the Nile Delta. Ships are docked there, hulls creaking as sailors unload cargo. Bales of cedar wood lie stacked beside jars of oil, baskets of incense, and gleaming nuggets of gold. Officials oversee the process, scribes dip their pens, soldiers guard the wealth. Nearby merchants haggle, villagers gawk at strange animals, and children chase each other through the crowd. The air is alive with the energy of exchange, the hum of a kingdom tied to the wider world dot in the end. Egypt's wealth was not simply the bounty of its fields, but the result of its reach. The Nile gave life, but trade gave prosperity. Grain fed the people, but gold gilded the temples. Papyrus carried words, but cedar raised roofs. Every kingdom must balance what it has with what it needs, and Egypt mastered this balance, turning its river valley into the heart of a trading empire. Its greatness was measured not only in monuments of stone, but in the flow of goods, wealth, and ideas that passed through its hands. No matter how fertile the Nile, how rich the granaries, or how tall the monuments, no kingdom survives without defense. For Egypt, protection was as essential as bread. Though the desert and river offered natural shields, the land was never free from danger. Nomadic raiders lurked beyond the frontiers. Rival kingdoms pressed against its borders, and even internal unrest threatened stability. To guard their fields, their wealth, and their monuments, the Egyptians built armies, not vast, permanent forces like later empires, but organized, disciplined, and capable of striking when needed. Soldiers stood at the edge of the kingdom, enduring hardship and danger, so that life along the Nile could remain steady. In the earliest days, Egypt relied on militia. When conflict arose, villages and towns set men to fight, armed with simple weapons, wooden clubs, spears tipped with flint, and shields of leather stretched over wood. These early fighters were not professional warriors, but farmers called to arms, defending their homes before returning to their fields. But as the kingdom grew, so too did the need for more permanent organization. Pharaohs realized that to project power, to protect trade, and to maintain unity, Egypt required a standing military. Out of this necessity, armies formed. The weapons of Egypt evolved with time. Copper replaced stone, then bronze replaced copper. Spears grew longer, axes sharper, shields stronger. Soldiers carried bows and arrows, simple but effective tools that could strike at distance. Later, chariots light, fast, and deadly would become symbols of Egypt's military might, allowing swift movement across the open desert. Armor was minimal, for the heat was oppressive, but helmets of leather and bronze offered some protection. To march as an Egyptian soldier was to rely not on heavy armor, but on speed, skill, and discipline. Discipline was everything. Soldiers, trained to march in formation to keep order even under fire. They learned to raise shields together, to thrust spears in unison, to advance as a wall of men rather than a mob. Officers drilled them constantly, ensuring that when battle came, they moved as one. Orders carried across ranks, drums, and horns, signaling maneuvers. Though the Egyptian army may not have been as heavily armed as others, its organization and cohesion made it formidable. The life of a soldier was harsh. Days were spent marching under the sun, carrying weapons, supplies, and little else. Food was coarse bread, dried fish, and onions. Water was rationed carefully, each drop precious in the desert. At night, men slept in camps of simple tents or under the stars, their weapons always at hand. Training was grueling, but the marshes were worse long treks across sand and rock, feet blistered, throats parched, backs aching beneath the weight of gear. Yet soldiers endured, for their lives were bound to duty. Guarding Egypt's borders was relentless work. To the south lay Nubia, rich in gold, but also a source of conflict. Expeditions marched there to secure resources, control trade, and fend off raids. To the east lay the Sinai, and beyond it the Levant, crossroads of trade and invasion alike. To the west stretched desert, home to nomadic groups who raided when opportunity arose. Soldiers were stationed in garrisons, small outposts of mud brick and stone, where they lived for months or years, watching the horizon for dust clouds that signaled danger. Isolation was part of the burden, far from families and fields, enduring boredom punctuated by sudden violence. War itself was brutal. Spears clashed, arrows darkened the sky, chariots thundered across the battlefield. Noise filled the air shouts of officers, cries of the wounded, the clash of wood and bronze. Soldiers fought not for personal glory, but for survival and the protection of their kingdom. Defeat meant devastation, for invaders would plunder fields, burn villages, and enslave survivors. Victory meant security, but it was always temporary. Threats returned, and soldiers marched again. The organization of Egypt's military extended beyond battle. Soldiers also built forts, patrolled trade routes, and escorted caravans. They protected workers in quarries and miners in deserts, ensuring that the kingdom's wealth flowed safely back to the Nile. They guarded borders against smugglers and rebels, maintaining order not only against foreign enemies, but within Egypt itself. In times of crisis, they could be summoned to the heart of the kingdom, enforcing the will of the pharaoh. Their presence was both shield and sword, a constant reminder of the state's power. For ordinary soldiers, rewards were modest. Pay came in the form of rations, grain, beer, and sometimes land grants after long service. Some earned spoils of war, small treasures taken from defeated foes. Others gained status, rising to positions of command. Yet most endured hardship without great reward, returning home weary and scarred. Their names seldom entered history, their deeds recorded only as part of collective victories. Still, they carried the burden of defense, ensuring that Egypt endured. The image of the soldier was tied to loyalty. Pharaohs depicted themselves as great warriors, smiting enemies beneath their feet, but behind these images stood thousands of men whose sweat and blood made such victories possible. Soldiers were the silent partners of rulers, invisible in records, but vital in reality. Their lives were hard, their deaths often unmarked, but their service was the wall that shielded the kingdom. Imagine standing at a frontier garrison in Nubia. The sun blazes overhead, the desert stretches endless, and the Nile glimmers in the distance. A small group of soldiers patrols the walls, their eyes scanning the horizon. Inside, men mend spears, share bread, and wait. Days are monotonous, but tension always lingers, for at any moment a raid could come, and their survival would depend on speed and discipline. Far from home, they endure not for glory, but for duty, sustaining a kingdom that may never know their names in the end. Egypt's greatness rested not only on its farmers, traders, and builders, but also on its soldiers. They were the guardians of borders, the escorts of wealth, the protectors of order. Their work was not glamorous, and their lives were often short, but without them the kingdom would have been vulnerable to every threat. The pyramids, temples, and treasures we admire today exist because soldiers stood watch centuries ago, enduring heat, hunger, and battle, so that the river's rhythm could continue unbroken. They were the quiet shield of Egypt, the unremembered defenders of its greatness. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture towering temples, colossal statues, and pyramids that pierce the desert sky. And these monuments seem eternal, as though they rose from the sands by magic. Yet behind every block of stone, every carved relief, and every painted wall were the hands of ordinary people, artisans and builders, whose labor transformed ideas into enduring reality. They were not kings, generals, or scribes, but the countless craftsmen who carved, painted, and built for a kingdom that rarely remembered their names. Their story is one of skill, hardship, and resilience hidden beneath the shine of Egypt's. Monuments dot the artisans of Egypt were masters of many trades. Stonecutters shaped limestone, sandstone, and granite into blocks and statues. Carvers incised hieroglyphs and scenes into walls, chiseling details that remain clear thousands of years. Later, painters decorated temples and tombs, filling spaces with vivid images of daily life, nature, and ceremony. Metal workers hammered copper and bronze into tools, ornaments, and fittings. Woodworkers shaped furniture, boats, and coffins. Each craft required years of training, passed from father to son, perfected through endless repetition. The builders, meanwhile, were the backbone of construction. Organized into crews, they hauled blocks, mixed mortar, raised scaffolding, and assembled structures that defied time. Their labor was heavy, their hours long, their bodies strained. Dust filled their lungs, sun scorched their skin, and accidents lurked at every step. Yet without them, temples would never have risen, tombs never have closed, statues never have stood in desert winds. They were the muscle that carried Egypt's ambitions from dream to stone. Life in artisan villages gives us glimpses into their world. At Deir el-Medina, a community of workers who built royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists have uncovered homes, tools, and records that reveal the daily rhythm of their lives. These workers were more skilled and privileged than common laborers, receiving regular rations of bread, beer, and vegetables, along with housing provided by the state. They lived with their families, shared meals, and organized themselves into teams for work. Their tasks were specialized. One man carved outlines, another painted, another polished. Together, they produced the breathtaking tombs whose walls still glow with color after thousands of years. But even in Deir el-Medina, life was not easy. The work inside tombs was hot and airless, the hours long, the demands exacting. Mistakes could not be tolerated, for a miscut line or poorly painted symbol could ruin months of labor. The pressure of perfection weighed heavily, especially when creating tombs for kings whose memory was expected to endure forever. Tools wore down quickly, requiring constant maintenance. Hands grew calloused, eyes strained in dim light, backs ached from bending over stone. The artisans may have been more privileged than farmers, but their comfort was relative. They still lived by the sweat of their brows. For builders, conditions were harsher still. Construction sites were chaotic, places of noise, dust, and danger. Men hauled heavy blocks on sledges, pulling in unison under the whip of overseers. Others lifted scaffolding, carried mud brick, or mixed mortar under the relentless sun. Falls, crushed limbs, and exhaustion were constant threats. Camps near the sites provided food and shelter, but they were crowded, noisy, and filled with the smell of sweat and smoke. Builders endured this for months at a time, returning home only when projects ended. Few left monuments to themselves. Their legacy was in the stones that outlived them. Despite the hardships, artisans and builders carried pride in their work. Their creations were visible to all, standing in temples, lining tombs, or looming as colossal statues. Even if their names were forgotten, their skill endured in every detail carved into stone. They were not anonymous to themselves, they knew which hands had shaped a statue's face, which brush had painted a lotus on a wall, which back had borne the weight of a block. Graffiti found in tombs shows workers leaving their marks, sometimes boasting, sometimes joking, proving that behind the grandeur were men with humor, identity, and pride. The state relied on their labor absolutely. Pharaohs might dream of eternal monuments, but without artisans to design and builders to construct, dreams remained sand. Every major project was a massive act of organization, marshaling not only resources but skills. Overseers planned, scribes recorded, but it was the artisans who transformed blank stone into art, and the builders who lifted walls skyward. Their labor turned visions into reality, creating the face of Egypt that still endures. Their work also reveals the interconnectedness of Egyptian society. Farmers grew the grain that fed the workers. Traders brought copper for chisels, wood for scaffolds, pigments for paint. Scribes kept track of supplies, soldiers guarded sites, and officials oversaw progress. The monuments we admire were not the work of kings alone, but the combined effort of an entire civilization. With artisans and builders at the center, imagine a day at a construction site in ancient Thebes. Dawn breaks and men gather in teams. Builders haul sledges loaded with limestone, their muscles straining as overseers shout commands. Stonecutters hammer at blocks, sparks flying as copper tools bite into rock. Carvers lean close, chiseling the delicate lines of hieroglyphs. Painters grind pigments of red, blue, and green, mixing them with water before filling carved figures. With color, the air hums with effort, filled with the sound of hammers, the rasp of saws, the murmur of voices. By sunset, progress is visible. A wall rises higher, a statue takes shape. A tomb glows with fresh paint. Then the men return to their camps, weary but knowing that tomorrow the work continues. The irony of their existence is clear. Egypt's kings claimed credit for monuments, their names carved in bold relief. Yet behind every royal inscription stood hundreds of unnamed artisans and builders whose skill and sweat made those names possible. Pharaohs were remembered because workers carved their likenesses into stone, but the workers themselves faded into anonymity. Their lives were consumed by labor that glorified others, their personal stories buried in silence. And yet, through the monuments they built, their presence still lingers, felt in every line and curve dotting the end. Artisans and builders were the true makers of Egypt's image. They were not the rulers, but the hands that gave rulers their immortality. Their chisels carved eternity, their brushes painted memory, their sweat raised stone into sky. They lived ordinary lives, faced hardship and toil, but their work endures as one of history's greatest legacies. The monuments of Egypt may bear the names of kings, but they are also the voices of countless anonymous craftsmen whose skill and labor shaped the kingdom into the wonder we still see today. When we imagine ancient Egypt, the eye is drawn to pyramids, colossal statues, and stone monuments that still rise from the desert after thousands of years. Yet these were not the places where ordinary Egyptians lived their lives. The true Egypt was built not of stone, but of mud brick, humble, perishable, and practical. Along the river banks and in the crowded streets of its cities, families lived in houses made from the very soil of the Nile. These homes did not endure like the pyramids. Sun, rain, and time reduced them to dust long ago. But for the people of Egypt, mud brick houses were the heart of daily life, places of cooking, sleeping, working, and gathering. They were fragile in form but enduring in memory, shaping the rhythm of existence for millions across the centuries. The choice of mud brick was natural. The Nile Valley offered little stone suitable for building houses. Stone was reserved for palaces, tombs, and monuments. But it offered something else, endless supplies of mud. Each year, when the floods receded, the river left behind layers of rich silt. Mixed with straw and water, this silt became clay that could be packed into wooden molds and left to dry in the sun. The result was the mud brick, cheap, easy to make, and perfectly suited for the hot, dry climate. Whole families joined in the process, stomping mud with their feet, mixing straw, pressing bricks, and stacking them in neat rows to bake under the sun. What they produced was not eternal, but it was enough. Most houses in Egypt were small and simple. In villages, a typical home had just a few rooms, one for cooking and storage, one for sleeping, and sometimes a courtyard open to the sky. Roofs were flat, made of palm logs and reeds plastered with mud, and they doubled as living spaces in the cooler evenings. Families slept there on hot summer nights, gazing at the stars, while during the day roofs were used to dry grain or hang laundry. Floors inside were packed earth, sometimes covered with mats of reeds. Furniture was sparse, a few low stools, woven baskets, perhaps a wooden chest. Beds were simple wooden frames strung with rope, covered by mats or linen sheets. It was a life without luxury, but with practicality and rhythm. In cities like Thebes and Memphis, houses grew taller and more complex. Crowded streets demanded that homes be built upward with 2 or even 3 stories stacked atop each other. Lower floors were dark, used for storage or animals, while upper floors provided light and air for families. Ladders and narrow staircases connected levels. In the busiest neighborhoods, houses pressed so close together that upper floors nearly touched, creating shade in the alleys below. These urban dwellings were noisy and bustling, filled with the sounds of children, animals, and neighbors shouting across courtyards. Privacy was rare, but community was constant. Daily life inside these homes was structured around survival and routine. In the mornings, women ground grain on stone querns, kneeling for hours to produce flour for bread. The rhythm of the grinding stone echoed through every house, a sound as common as the flow of the river. Clay ovens baked flat loaves, their smoke curling through courtyards. Men left to work in fields, workshops, or construction sites, while children helped with chores, fetching water from wells, tending goats or chickens, carrying fuel for cooking. Inside, rooms smelled of smoke, fresh bread, and the earthy scent of mud brick itself. Food preparation dominated household life. Baskets of grain-lined walls, jars of beer fermented in corners, and clay pots held onions, garlic, and beans. Women brewed beer thick enough to serve as food, stirred stews of vegetables, and occasionally roasted meat when available. Their house was a workshop of sustenance, each corner devoted to feeding the family. Mud brick houses, though fragile, could be adapted endlessly. Families expanded them as needed, adding extra rooms or rebuilding collapsed walls. Courtyards became spaces for animals or workshops, where men carved wood, women spun flax, or children learned trades. Roofs sprouted storage bins and shelters. The houses grew and changed with the families inside, shaped by necessity rather than design. Though modest, houses reflected social status. The wealthy lived in larger compounds, with multiple courtyards, painted walls, and fine furniture. Some decorated interiors with plastered walls, painted in bright colors, showing geometric designs or scenes of nature. Floors might be covered with mats or even tiles. Servants occupied small side rooms, while kitchens and storerooms supplied the household. These houses, though still made of mud brick, were symbols of prestige, standing apart from the simpler huts of farmers. Yet even the grandest homes could not escape the fragility of their material. Time and weather wore them down, demanding constant repair. The fragility of mud brick shaped Egyptian memory. Unlike stone temples or tombs, houses did not survive for millennia. Archaeologists find their traces as outlines in the earth, foundations of crumbled walls, fragments of ovens and pots. These ruins tell us that while monuments were eternal, daily life was transient, renewed with each generation. Families built, lived, and rebuilt, their homes vanishing into dust as surely as their lives ended in time. This impermanence gave Egyptian life its rhythm, stable and cycle, fragile and detailed. Inside the houses, life was intimate and communal. Families shared rooms, meals, and work. Children grew up underfoot, learning trades and chores from parents. Neighbors lived within earshot, their voices carrying through thin walls. The closeness created bonds, but also tension. Disputes between families were common, settled in streets or by local officials. Yet this crowded, noisy existence was the essence of urban Egypt, a people tied together not only by river and kingdom, but by the mud brick walls that pressed them side by side. Imagine stepping into an Egyptian home at dusk. The air is warm, the mud brick walls glowing in the fading light. In the courtyard, a woman tends a clay oven, pulling out flat loaves of bread. Children play nearby, their laughter echoing off walls. A man returns from work, setting down his tools, washing his hands in a basin. The smell of stew drifts through the rooms, mingling with the earthy scent of brick and smoke. Neighbors call across rooftops, sharing news while donkeys bray in. The distance. Inside, mats are spread, lamps lit, and families gather for their evening meal. The house is humble, fragile, temporary, yet it is also full of life. In the end, mud brick houses were the true Egypt. The pyramids may have defined its skyline, but mud brick defined its existence. Every farmer, artisan, scribe, and laborer returned, each evening to walls of clay, roofs of reed, and rooms filled with family. These homes did not endure, but they carried the heart of the kingdom. They were places of cooking, laughter, argument, rest, and love, places where Egypt's people lived their lives, generation after generation, shaping a civilization not only in stone, but in the quiet rhythm of daily domestic life. Every civilization eventually falls silent, yet some leave echoes that never fade. Ancient Egypt, more than perhaps any other, carved its name into the memory of humanity. The pyramids still rise from the desert as if time itself has been powerless. Against them, hieroglyphs still line walls with symbols of birds, eyes, and reeds, their beauty undimmed after thousands of years. Even the idea of Egypt, its sand, its river, its monuments, remains so vivid that it feels eternal. But Egypt's kingdoms were not eternal. They rose, flourished, and fell as all powers do. What endures is the legacy they built, the memory of a civilization that combined ingenuity, endurance, and human effort into something larger than life. The legacy of Egypt begins with its people. For over 3,000 years, generations of farmers, artisans, scribes, soldiers, and rulers built layer upon layer of culture along the Nile. Their daily lives may have seemed ordinary at the time, grinding grain, hauling water, chiseling stone, but in their accumulation, they created a civilization of astonishing depth. Each act, each harvest, each monument became part of a vast tapestry that still fascinates us today. The endurance of Egypt is not only in its monuments, but in the ordinary lives that sustained them. The physical reminders of Egypt's greatness are everywhere in its former lands. The pyramids of Giza remain the most iconic, their outlines instantly recognizable across the world. Temples and tombs, though weathered, still display carvings of daily life, scenes of boats on the Nile, of hunters with nets, of artisans at work. Statues stand with calm, timeless gazes, their faces worn but still expressive. These are not simply ruins, but voices of the past, speaking across time to remind us of the endurance of stone, skill, and vision. But the true endurance of Egypt is not only in what was built, but in how it shaped the world. Egypt's writing system, hieroglyphs, was among the earliest complex scripts, influencing writing across the Mediterranean. Its papyrus sheets spread literacy and record-keeping far beyond its borders. Its art and architecture inspired Greece, Rome, and through them much of the Western world. Its wealth, drawn from the Nile and trade, made it a central player in ancient politics. Even when Egypt's power waned, its memory remained vivid, carried in stories, myths, and records that traveled far from its desert heart. Egypt's legacy also endured through its adaptability. Across its long history, Egypt faced invasions, droughts, internal struggles, and shifting powers. Nubians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans all came to rule its land. Yet through each change, Egypt absorbed, adapted, and continued. Its people maintained their rhythms of farming, their crafts of linen and pottery, their devotion to order and balance. Even when ruled by outsiders, Egypt remained Egypt, its character enduring through centuries of change. The fragility of daily life in mud-brick houses did not prevent the survival of memory. Though those homes crumbled quickly, the knowledge of how people lived has been preserved through carvings, papyri, and the remnants left in the earth. Archaeologists reconstruct kitchens, workshops, and streets, giving us glimpses of a life that would otherwise be forgotten. This preservation is itself part of the legacy, that Egypt not only created wonders but left traces enough for us to understand them. Thousands of years later, the image of Egypt has always stirred imagination. For the ancient Greeks, Egypt was already old, a land of mystery and wisdom. For the Romans, it was a place of wealth and marvels, a jewel in their empire. For travelers of later centuries, its ruins inspired awe, curiosity, and even obsession. Explorers, scholars, and artists drew inspiration from its monuments, carrying images of pyramids and obelisks across the world. Today, Egypt's heritage is studied in classrooms, displayed in museums, and visited by millions, a global memory that continues to inspire wonder. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of Egypt is the reminder of endurance through human effort. Behind every pyramid block was a worker's hand. Behind every hieroglyph was a scribe's brush. Behind every harvest was a farmer's sweat. Egypt's greatness was not built by kings alone, but by countless unnamed people, whose lives combined to create a civilization of unmatched longevity. Their names may be lost, but their work remains, written into stone, soil, and memory. Imagine standing at Giza today. The desert wind blows, the sun beats down, and the pyramids rise above the horizon. Cars pass nearby, planes fly overhead, but the stone remains, as it has for over 4,000 years. Tourists walk the sand, staring upward in awe, their voices hushed before the weight of history. In that moment, the past feels close, as if the workers who hauled the stones, the scribes who recorded their numbers, the farmers who fed them all, still linger in the air. This is Egypt's legacy, not only monuments but presence, a civilization that remains alive in memory long after its kingdoms faded dot. In the end, the endurance of Egypt is not only in stone, but in story. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still stand, and the memory of the kingdom still lives in our imagination. It is a legacy of resilience, ingenuity, and human spirit. The kingdoms of Egypt rose and fell, but their memory has never died. They remind us that civilizations are mortal, but their stories can be eternal. Egypt built more than monuments. It built memory, and that is why, thousands of years later, we still speak of it with wonder.